Welcome to the Antidote. This is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
And this is Greg McCarran.
All right, Greg, we are back in the saddle after having off and on conversations. It's always good to talk with you and to ground ourselves in a little bit of sanity through facts and analysis. And there is just so much going on, and it does feel overwhelming at times. But we are going to do our best to cover the terrain as it is still unfolding in this moment. And so there's a lot to cover, as there's things such as the ongoing Las Vegas investigation, pretty obvious cover up, and the all kinds of propaganda from all sides in relationship to that operation. And there's also this major push around the country and even around the world in relationship to the retelling of the Vietnam War narrative with this $30 million backed 10-year long documentary process by Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, which
Jeremy, you've mentioned a lot of the funding for this documentary as well. It's coming from like all different sides of the establishment, kind of that whole circle from all different sides, and that's really interesting as well. The funding for it and the
Yes, and we'll work to try to connect a lot of these dots. And so maybe today we will have a much more like maybe free flowing conversation. We can jump back and forth amongst different topics as we will, because there's also Harvey Weinstein and the falling of the so-called left sexual perversion of Hollywood, and which of course is also, there's tons of propaganda and cover-up surrounding that. And then there is Iran and the nuclear deal and the machinations surrounding that, and maybe touching back on this Vietnam War push. Especially in relationship to the way that the narratives, especially from the right, are being constructed around Las Vegas, we begin to see resonance in relationship to the false left-right dichotomies and boxes that are being constructed for our minds and for our dialogue. But yeah, heading into this Vietnam War documentary, you're right. I noticed. I did not realize this thing came up on me a little bit out of nowhere, and I did not realize what a major propaganda operation and push this thing was. But the minute that I began to look at the the actual page on PBS that thanks all of the sponsors for this thing, you begin to see, yeah, a lot of these are not quite the forces that you might suspect want you to know the whole truth, so help you God, about the Vietnam War and that dark era of American foreign and domestic policy. They include such patriotic organizations as the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Brothers, the Bank of America, which, by the way, when I saw when Ken Burns went to the Woodrow Wilson Center, headed by one Jane Harmon. Jane Harmon did the introduction, and then after that, it was the Bank of America, I think the CEO, that came on to then welcome Ken Burns. And he let drop that Bank of America runs all of the banking services, financial services on all of the military bases around the entire world. So I'm sure they have no interest in the narrative that would reinforce the justification of American militarism and expansionism around the world. But
no,
of course, it's
yeah.
much deeper than just the single, I mean, how much money does Bank of America make on military members around the world? A lot, but it's probably not that much. There's much deeper institutional sinew that holds together this group of funders. And many people, including Ken Burns, has made the point that includes the whole, the whole spectrum, the quote-unquote whole spectrum of viewpoints, because there's the Pew Foundation and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the National Endowment for the Arts, I believe. And
Didn't you mention the Koch brothers as well were involved in funding as well?
the Kochs are prominent in this, and the Blavatnik Family Foundation. Yeah, I mean, so this is, the who's who. This is not the full spectrum of American perspective. This is the who's who of the so-called elite,
And I guess
the establishment
Blavatnik,
consensus. Go for it, Greg.
I guess Blavatnik would be considered as being woke by a lot of these people on the quote alt right because Blavatnik, supports Trump and even I think even resigned from Oxford over something regarding some type of controversy over supporting Trump, and of course he also supports Vladimir Putin in addition to Netanyahu. So I mean that's pretty woke according to a lot of these people, and his entities are heavily involved in this. So that says a lot, I think.
City of London is getting woke. It's true.
Hey, Daniel Estulin says it's the Rothschilds supported Trump over the Rockefellers who supported Clinton. So maybe London is woke up.
Good for Ken Burns in bringing together the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds and Blavatniks, and he really is healing the divide amongst the this establishment divide has gone on too long. What they can agree to have a consensus upon is that it's not important at all to talk about the false flag deceptions that increased the American presence in Vietnam that led to hundreds of thousands and millions of more deaths after such things as the Gulf of Tonkin. Or it's also, I'm sure Ken Burns is really healing the divide of the establishment where they can agree that it's not even important to talk about the powers that Kennedy turned against in relationship to many of his policies, including the Vietnam War. And somehow, even though all of their they brag about Burns and Novick brag about how they were continued to update their perspective to the very last moment of the editing process and to include all of the perspectives and the historical revisions that were taking place. And somehow they miss the entirety of such things as the National Security Memorandum 263, I believe it is, which showed Kennedy's intent to begin to pull out of Vietnam. And I believe he was of course doing a political strategy in terms of he intended to do it after the election because he thought he would be seen as weak on communism or something like that. And I do believe that was an error that both of the Kennedy brothers who got assassinated made, is that they tried to play politics behind the scene and save their truth-telling until they were in a more secure seat of power. And that's something that I've always held to, is that what the lesson to be learned from the assassinations of the 60s is that truth tellers or political leaders of some courage or are having enlightening processes go on in relationship to their view of the world and beginning to make courageous turns against some of the more treasonous establishment, that the thing to do is not to wait until you've been reelected president or you've been elected president in the case of Robert Kennedy, but to tell the whole truth immediately to the people. Thomas Jefferson would remind you of this. The only thing that can secure the liberty in this country is that the entirety of the people are educated and know what is happening, not political machinations behind the scenes. But putting that aside...
That's exactly what Donald Trump... I'll throw this in. I don't even believe Donald Trump is a JFK or even an RFK, but that's something Donald Trump is not doing. He's not throwing the full truth out there. And people who are waiting for him to try to play politics and try to change things, it's not going to happen. I don't think, first of all, he intends to change anything in the first place. But even if he did have some master plot to change things secretly behind the scenes, it's not going to happen like that.
Completely agreed. Things such as where Trump has already had his Obama moment in relationship to 9/11 treason, the ongoing cover-up, the ongoing depiction that 9/11 somehow came from the hills of Afghanistan, and thus the continued authorization to use military force emanating from the United States is anything but an ongoing part of the aid and comfort given to the enemies that actually attacked us on September 11th. So that is already, Trump is disqualified. Okay, Kennedy was also, he was also disqualified early on He did escalate aspects of CIA destabilization campaigns and warfare around the world, but he also changed his mind. And so I think it is a good point for those that support Trump or who have hope that Trump is some type of candidate for a sleeper patriot. Yeah. The way to do that is to tell the truth in his face immediately. That includes InfoWars. Dude, point out
not blaming Saudi Arabia and dancing Muslims for September 11th.
No, it's to point out that Donald Trump's speech about Afghanistan was treason. And the only way to heal that is to call it out.
And his Iran speech as well was treason.
That's a good point. That's a very good point, actually, because he, in terms of this Iran speech, he trotted out stuff that we haven't heard since the craziest of the neocons were chatting in the wake of September 11th, when there was still the connections of Al Qaeda and Iran and 9/11 and Iran and the African embassy bombings. And this is just completely this stuff is like not even disinformation that's had any credibility amongst the credible establishment for more than a decade.
And the other thing about this, Jeremy, is that it's even more dangerous, I think, in some ways, because now Trump's openly aligning himself with people who are push theories about groups like Hezbollah having influence at the borders, on top of the regular hysteria about Islam and terrorism in Iran and all these various countries in the Middle East. There's people who were putting theories that they're right on our borders, posing as illegal Mexican immigrants.
That's interesting. That has a lot of resonance with the ascent of the InfoWars Breitbart Drudge conjunction in the sort of last half of the Obama years, where it was or Project Veritas, where it's all about putting on a Bin Laden mask at the border and swimming in the Rio Grande with an Osama mask, and then some, like, we have informants from the FBI that Al Qaeda has cells and ISIS is setting up mosques across the border in Mexico, and now it's Hezbollah. I mean, this stuff is such crude Zionist propaganda that it should be scorned by anybody who takes themselves seriously at all. And yet this is sort of exactly what InfoWars is trucking and bartering. And I guess that is, as you pointed out, after you got cut off yesterday and calling into InfoWars show with Owen Schroyer, that this is what InfoWars folks are paid to talk about, and then there's other things that they're paid not to talk about, such as the obvious Zionist interests in both September 11th, including Zionist involvement, but the entirety of the war on terror. And why is it that it's Michael Chertoff who's always there in relationship to the kind of economic interests around the backscatter machines, the rapist scans, as I call them, in relationship to very, very shady, pretty obviously intelligence-related black operations, such as the so-called underwear bomber, and then this Las Vegas operation blamed on an obvious, a federal agent of some sort. So this is the milieu of InfoWars, is that they will take some anonymous word from some anonymous FBI agent, at least anonymous to we the people, the tip of the spear.
Don't question Alex Jones's sources; they're legitimate to the bone.
Yes, and even see, what's interesting about this Las Vegas operation is that what Alex was pushing early on is that what the sheriff and the FBI are covering up is that there was Antifa garbage, ISIS garbage all over this guy's room, and okay,
they were pushing that yesterday too.
So that doesn't stop. What's interesting about that is Alex said that he got this information from an unidentified informant from the hostage rescue group, which might be true, that this person might have seen these things in the room. That's an interesting possibility. That should be looked into. That should be dissected. If that is the case, then who was in the room beforehand? Was it just that the Lee Harvey Oswald of the 2017 just sort of left his Antifa flyers everywhere and his ISIS garbage? Or was this, if that is the case, is this obviously a scene that was set up by those that were involved in this? And I mean, just the material evidence is obvious that no matter what's happening, whether this is what kind of guns are being shot or whether this is being projected out through speakers or whatever it is, it's very obvious from acoustic analysis, forensic acoustic analysis. Mike Adams at Natural News has done an interesting analysis of it. It's clear that there's two different shooters from two different distances happening in this incident. So this thing obviously is a conspiracy, as it is termed, and this has a lot of resonance with these events that we've seen in the recent years. Whether it's the Pulse nightclub or San Bernardino or these types of things, where there's always these reports of other and multiple gunmen, and then it's then whittled down to the isolated patsy. And I would point people to actually look at there is a lot of resonance with this Las Vegas operation with the Pulse nightclub, actually. Because in the wake of the Pulse nightclub, another guy was apparently arrested who was connected to Mateen and looked like he was part of maybe some type of cell, a CIA cell, or a cell that was being made to look like a CIA cell, who turned himself in, actually, I think, in Santa Monica, California, right in the wake of that. Said he was scared for his life. And their CIA-connected gun runner was then arrested in Tennessee, apparently. I don't know exactly what the status of all of that is in the wake of the Las Vegas operation, but it's barely being held together. The Las Vegas sheriff is clearly deeply disturbed. He's barely holding himself together during the press conferences. The FBI special agent in charge is looking pretty sociopathic and robotic and like an actor of some sort. And they've just collected a lot of witnesses' phones and apparently turned them back to them with everything erased. I don't know if that's true, but this thing is looking very, very suspicious. As you pointed out on InfoWars Air yesterday, there was this 4chan warning in around September 11th that pointed out that there was these high casualty incidents or something like that that were suspected of being in the making, and that there was connections to Adelson and Chertoff and these machines, these body scanner machines there was going to be an amplification of that, and there was potentially some type of economic or financial shenanigans similar to September 11th with people selling off stock and that type of thing. So, do you have any thing you want to add in terms of the things that you covered in your call yesterday?
Well, yeah, those were what I brought up with Owen Schroyer. I brought up the 4chan article, which I give you credit for bringing to my attention, and then I also mentioned the original sources that pointed out Stephen Paddock's alleged connections to Islam and to was, I believe, Daily Media via Rita Katz's site intelligence group, which I pointed out to Owen Schroyer is always the first organization which is always there to blame ISIS or some radical Muslim group for any type of action that could be attributed as being a terrorist attack anywhere it happens in the West. And I brought this up, and I also specifically mentioned to Owen that you're not hearing about this from either from InfoWars or from Breitbart or from the so-called liberal media that they oppose so much, and that nobody's bringing this stuff up. Nobody's mentioning any of this stuff. Instead, they're all fighting amongst each other over who's to blame for the attack, and they're leaving all this stuff out of their narrative. And then, Owen got kind of snide and kind of cut me off and made a comment about, people always want to blame Israel for everything. And I kind of threw in a comment about, well, that's opposed to just blaming the Muslims for everything, or and that you're paid to not focus on Israel. And I don't know if that those comments made the cut on air. I guess you said they didn't, but that's what I called in to talk to Owen about because Owen earlier in the show, and this is the first time I'd listened to Infowars in a while. The first time I had time to actually tune into an Infowars broadcast in quite some time. So I listened, and I decided to call in because I heard Owen played a clip of one of Alex Jones's very special breaking news transmissions where he's going on about the ISIS paraphernalia and the Antifa literature in Stephen Paddock's room allegedly and all this stuff. And I guess, these things about this sheriff are very, very true, I think, in a lot of ways. He's very shaken and he seems very uncomfortable and unnerved about a lot of things. But it appears to me that this is being twisted by the whole InfoWars, Alex Jones, the whole Israel first, the Kudnik kind of alt-light set with Mike Cernovich and Lauren Loomer and all these people, that it's the whole, they're using this sheriff and possible efforts to possibly cover up certain things on behalf of people within the FBI to push this as a leftist Islamist plot. And it's just extremely deceitful, and I think it shows just how badly co-opted, and we've talked about this, and no doubt we'll talk about this again in the future, just how badly co-opted the conspiracy culture has been, especially since the rise of Trump. I mean, it mainly goes back to the Obama days and even before that, because I think this movement's always been controlled to a large extent. But, I mean, it's just become so badly co-opted in such a negative direction, and this is another great example of that, and it's only going to get worse from here on out. Instead of actually exposing false flags for what they are, they're using it for an agenda to blame the left and blame Islam and blame whatever perceived enemies of Donald Trump in the right wing.
Yes. So not only are the elements of the security state in a shaky place right now in terms of their narrative around Las Vegas, a lot of people can see that there's a massive cover-up going on here, and there is a lot of source data that can be pretty easily shown to conflict with this whole idea of a lone nut gunman with no clear motive. And at the same time, like you pointed out, this is also a shaky time for such controlled right organizations such as InfoWars, because in order to keep some bit of credibility, they have to at least mouth an openness to a potential indicators of false flag operations, of state-sponsored terrorism run through certain elements of state or private intelligence networks, either within the United States or without. But they also in order to continue on the political route that they've chosen for many, many years, to team up with these sort of worst Islamophobes and left baiters of the right, they're going to have to also try to put that back in the box, or, like you pointed out, to try to associate it with their go-to, just the ISIS garbage, Islamic garbage, or Antifa garbage. And it's interesting is that of the independent journalists who are on the scene, and independent journalists right now really could make a big, big difference on the scene, on the ground in Las Vegas, following up some of these very obvious data points that put the lie to the narrative that's being pushed out of the FBI. Apparently, a few of them could actually make a big difference here. And actually, they've just started closing down the press conferences, which were very open before. And it looks like just as they are starting to close down the press conferences, the so-called independent journalists who come on the scene are people like Laura Loomer, who you talked about, who's who actually went on Alex Jones's Sunday show a few weeks ago, and they were talking mad, crazy Zionist Islamophobia on there. And Laura Loomer was leading the pack, and I called in, and Alex announced my name, and then somehow my name went missing again. And for the fourth or fifth time in a row where I've been announced he's going to come to me, he somehow doesn't
You don't want to
get to
talk
me.
to you, Jeremy. He just doesn't want to talk to you.
So now Laura Loomer has taken the place of the actual 9/11 truth, grassroots people who were on the ground confronting politicians, and now it's all Laura Loomer confronting Hillary Clinton at her book signings. I don't know how Hillary Clinton is still in power, but how about we confront some of the people actually running the government at this point?
Jeremy, are you saying you want Hillary as president?
No.
Come on. You want Hitlery as president? That's what they'll ask you. That's what they say when you bring this stuff up. When you start criticizing Trump and the controlled right. Oh, you must have wanted Hitlery in there as president.
It's interesting. So there's this new coalescence, an alliance with the rebel media and Laura Loomer. And then also Jason Goodman is on the ground there. And somehow they're not asking the questions that really put the lie to the narrative. So this is where InfoWars now is. They haven't even put their own reporter on the ground. I thought he had to increase the funding, buy the supplements. Now we're going to start a D.C. bureau. Still haven't seen any real questions out of the D.C. bureau. They have the access to the White House, right? They could be in the White House briefing room asking serious questions about 9/11 when Trump says that it's from Afghanistan.
Interesting that there's not a whole lot of actual like physical developments in that area, but I can guarantee you, Mr. Corsi is definitely influencing the operation at some level. But yeah, as far as actual like progress that we can see, it hasn't been made. Although I'm sure that the efforts are going on behind the scenes to control and to manipulate and steer InfoWars in the right direction, so to speak. You're not seeing the progress on the ground with what all of your money that goes to products and supporting the operation is supposed to go to. We're not seeing a whole lot of progress.
No, it's sort of become all about
other than
anonymous.
Roger Stone his radio show.
Yeah, anonymous sources, anonymous tips from within certain sources like Cernovich and Stone and Corsi, people within the milieu, in the White House, or from Alex, it's just I have sources inside the FBI, inside the CIA, inside the hostage rescue. I won't actually back it up with second sources or anything like that, or let the people know what's going on. And then also, as we've noted before, it's an increase of chatter out of Israeli intelligence that's put directly on the InfoWars airwaves. So yeah, it makes you more than wonder, and they can't get a single reporter on the ground to blow open with open source data. This very obvious continuity of the Operation Gladio here at home.
Jeremy, I've heard that Robert Mueller is secretly leading the FBI operation in the FBI investigation. That the FBI and the Feds and the Antifas and the Islamists are keeping the grassroots InfoWars correspondents from getting on the ground.
Well, he's a Wahhabist, probably. It was probably John Brennan turned him into a Wahhabist. I'm probably his wife's probably wears a hijab.
Probably secretly best friends with Huma Abedin.
Yeah. So obviously we're not going to look to InfoWars for the analysis and the facts on the ground that we need to know. But that does not mean that everywhere that they touch or everything that they touch is not important to look at. I would urge people to dig into Las Vegas and to think about the strategic ways that they could pry this narrative further open, because this is an important moment. This is obviously it looks like the big Operation Gladio style operation for the 21st century. The idea of snipers up high. In some way, it's a continuity of the Dallas shooting. What'd you say?
Mm-hmm. I just fear that, I mean, history is a precedence for this. We're going to see more and more of this kind of stuff. We don't know when and where, but I mean, clearly there's going to be more of this stuff happening. I don't want to sound like a pessimist, but I mean, that's pretty clear that there's going to be more of this, but just be prepared.
Well, we need to be prepared by deconstructing the resonance of the analysis with what was being done and why back in Europe in the post-World War II era, where it was very clear that the purpose was to make average people feel vulnerable in almost every situation that they were in. And that there were political forces that were associated with, some, whether it's communists or leftists or populists or Islamists or Antifa, that there's these sort of forces that are sort of, or Al-Qaeda. Remember the September 11th narrative was sort of like there's this nebulous force out there that can break through all of our security systems and can overcome all of our intelligence networks and military and stuff like that, and strike at any moment and both at random and in targeted ways. And that was part of Gladio. It was an attempt to politicize everyday life in a highly weaponized and sort of psychological warfare manner. And so we need to deconstruct that. We need to show that there's a sinew here of these kinds of operations, and to not go looking at the Australia Antifa page if you're going to try to see what the actual motives of the actual perpetrators of these kind of operations. No, you need to look much higher, much closer to home. What kind of town is Las Vegas? People should go look at Steve Wynn's interesting testimony to the mainstream news when he talked about the kind of security measures that he'd already taken in his casinos.
Another one of Trump's big donors, LOL.
Yes. So, and of course, Las Vegas, as we've spoken about before, people like Mnuchin, the idea that this is the town where the so-called deep state, which is where the criminal black economy, the gangster network, hooks up with the national security state and the shadow government. That Las Vegas is, if there's a single city in the country that represents that, it's Las Vegas.
That New York.
And New York City, and the conjunction is sort of Las Vegas was the Wild West, where the mob interests, whether Zionist mob interests or Italian mob interests, could get together and run things in the Wild West in many ways. So, of course, that is the context under which this kind of operation happens.
And once again, what this shows, and we talked about this before, is that once again, it's another indicator that indeed Donald Trump is a political outsider as far as the D.C. establishment goes, but Donald Trump is completely, intimately connected at a very significant level at this other element of the quote-unquote deep state establishment that nobody pays attention to hardly, and that's this criminal underworld element with all these mob figures and these organized crime figures with significant ties to the Zionist state of Israel, perhaps even more loyal and intimately connected than many within the political establishment in D.C. are. And I'll say this: you want to look at a motive for Las Vegas, go look at take the 4chan warning into consideration. Go look at Rita Katz's website and see all the different attacks she's come out and blamed ISIS for. Look at these people in Las Vegas like Steve Wynn and Sheldon Adelson. And then look at what they all have in common. And it's a very, very considerable amount of loyalty and devotion to the state of Israel. And I think you're finding another type of possible motive for this attack. And I'm not saying Israel's behind it or anything, I don't know, but there's another possible motive for this attack that nobody from InfoWars to the liberal media is paying any attention to.
Very important points, actually, because I did notice that how the direct ties to the wake of Las Vegas seem very similar to the direct ties to Israel in the wake of September 11th. Whether it's things like Netanyahu saying that this was going to be good then catching himself, but it'll help the people of the United States understand in a way. And so you see, in addition to the obvious nature that we're getting all these interpretations about how this was potentially related to ISIS, including Paddock's alleged Muslim name that he took 6 months ago. This is almost all being fed or interpreted through both Rita Katz at Side Intelligence, which I believe is located in the DC area, but it's very obviously some type of proxy or outpost of Israeli military intelligence, but then also directly into the Israeli press, who is reported on his Paddock's alleged Muslim name. And then I noticed one last thing, as I noticed that in Tel Aviv, one of the maybe the government buildings or something like that put up an American flag, the colors. So that reminded me of the idea of September 11th as the big wedding, as the way that that now the Americans will know what it's like to be an Israeli and continually under threat from these terrorists and barbarians.
Yeah, we're supposed to believe that Paddock, within like weeks or months of getting a Muslim name, that he's all of a sudden become radicalized enough to just want to go out and kill people in the name of Islam or whatever. It's like, it's another thing that's kind of, it's pretty ridiculous when you just think about it a little bit. But I mean, that's just something else there. But but anyway, just keep questioning this. Don't take the word of these obvious co-opted alternative media outlets, but look at what they're saying. Maybe take some of what they're saying and look into it, and then find your own results from it, and don't take their word for it. But maybe capitalize on some of the things they're saying that are interesting, and then I bet if you really look at it independently and really look at it with an open mind, you'll probably come to a much different conclusion than a lot of these quote alternative media outlets are coming to. And don't take our word for it either, but just this does need to be looked into it and dissected at every level. So,
and just because InfoWars is not giving you the true the full truth doesn't mean that the controlled left and all of the calls on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! For some type of Australian type of gun grab is the solution. As I've said before to all the Code Pink types, you stand down the most intense, most violently destructive warfare state in the history of humanity, as far as we know, and then we can talk about the issues of guns in the hands of average human beings. So yeah, all the talk about the bump stock and all of that. You don't even know who did this yet. Maybe you should think about shutting down covert operations in your country, or shutting down the partnership with the military garrison state operating out of Tel Aviv, highly hooked up to the highest levels of your government, before you start talking about the average person's relationship with bump stocks. Okay, so yeah, I agree with you, Greg. Let's keep this investigation moving, not getting stuck in these controlled boxes left and right. And one thing I was thinking is that the resonance with this Vietnam, the eras, and the sort of the Gladio was sort of amplified during the 60s in Europe, and this Vietnam War push, it is massive. And so I'm wondering whether there is something going on here about history, the attempt by our wannabe rulers to make history rhyme. And Ken Burns, in talking about his Vietnam War documentary, has pointed out that Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And then he does this funny thing about talking about, it's the same as back then. There was an embattled president with, calling the media fake, and with leaks and allegations of cooperation with foreign governments, and that is such the easy parallel. And meanwhile, I would urge people to go look at episode 2. I think all the episodes have been released online, and look at episode 2, which is the episode that covers the Kennedy assassination, or should I say, doesn't cover the assassination. And they basically, then Kennedy was assassinated, and then they jump ahead like almost a year, I think. They do not explain any of the involvement of Johnson in re-escalating this. And I would have people look at a few different analyses that have been done very, very, very well online by people like Jim D. Eugenio at Kennedy's and King website, where he talks about, he actually analyzes exactly the way that this is a CIA cover-up. in relationship to covering up Lansdale's role in a lot of this. Supposedly, I haven't watched the entire documentary. It's 18 hours in total, but supposedly the Dulles brothers are not even mentioned, I think. So there's people like John Pilger on Consortium News wrote an article about the killing of history that talks about how the beginning of this film, the narrator says the war was begun in good faith by decent people out of fateful misunderstandings, American overconfidence, and Cold War misunderstandings. And then Pilger goes on to say the dishonesty of this statement is not surprising. The cynical,
like Iraq.
Like Iraq, right. A cynical fabrication of, quote, false flags that led to the invasion of Vietnam is a matter of record. The Gulf of Tonkin, quote, incident in 1964, which Burns promotes as true, was just one. There's a lot of this, and people should go look at it. Steve Lendman wrote a really interesting article called Ken Burns Defends His Indefensible Reinvention of Vietnam War History. The whitewash of the CIA continues at Caucus 99% blog. Getting the Gulf of Tonkin wrong are Ken Burns and Lynn Novick, quote, telling stories about the central events used to legitimize the U.S. attack against Vietnam by James Williamson in Counter Punch. And I just want to read this quote and then do one last analysis of my personal take on this. He says that Burns and Novick are noted for specializing in the delivery of emotion-laden stories, quote, stories. Are they to be allowed to turn actually important fundamental facts about the U.S. war into a, quote, story as well? And that's my concern about this, is that I actually went to a few events that were surrounding this. In the Lawrence, Kansas City area, there is a massive push. The Kansas City Public Library is doing a whole series of events in conjunction with the a federal arts organization. Is it the Endowment for the Arts or something like that? I think, and it includes aspects that refer to the film. They just had an event with the Tim O'Brien, the author, the writer, and soldier of conscience who wrote The Things They Carried About Vietnam War. And I passed out a flyer there that included a lot of these references. And you could tell Tim O'Brien had a very specific perspective about the criminality of Vietnam at some level, while also holding the humanity of all those on the ground on all sides. And you could tell he held his tongue a lot, and he then began to sort of get into it at the very end in response to a question. But not yet at any of these events has there been any space made to actually deconstruct the narrative, the CIA propaganda that is obviously being done through this Burns film. And Burns is an interesting character. Like I have seen some of his films, especially the ones about maybe more cultural things like jazz and bits of bass, his film about baseball and his film about Frank Lloyd Wright. And I haven't seen his films about the Civil War, and I guess he did a film about World War II. So I didn't realize that he was such a tool of propaganda as this film shows him to be. And I'm trying to get people to understand the sophisticated aspect of the way they're doing it, because it's being done as we're allowing all sides to tell their story, and a lot of it's being told through the eyes and ears and mouth of veterans sort of close to the ground. I went to an event at Liberty Hall here in Lawrence with the very deep veteran John Musgrave, I think. And I interjected at a few points because it became very clear to me that the event, they promised it as an event where there was going to be a discussion about what it means to be a patriot. And I very quickly realized that this was not actually an open conversation. They had everybody write their questions down on cards, and they chose very specifically of the questions that didn't get too deep, is what it looked like to me. And so I interjected a few times, and a lot of people expressed anger or discomfort at it, including some of the people who were working at the event who tried to silo me and made me go out the back after the event was over and say that I couldn't talk to people because people were going to be uncomfortable or something like that. But I did talk to people afterwards, and some people thanked me for saying what I said. And then at this Tim O'Brien event in Kansas City, I actually went up and spoke with John Musgrave myself and let him know who I was, and that I didn't mean any offense to him specifically as a human. He was being honored for his work with veterans and who he was as a person that evening. And I also was touched emotionally by it too. And so in the midst of that, I felt it was my patriotic duty to insert a few difficult questions and facts about who was funding this film, why was it being left out, about the obvious Kennedy turn about this, and the fact that certain forces that were against that turn were involved, along with others, in the pretty obvious assassination of the sitting president. And then I also said at one point, yeah, we also have 100,000 dead soldiers in the wake of September 11th. If you count up the likely result of all the suicides in the wake of it. And John Musgraves, after shaking my hand, he told me that he appreciated it very greatly that I brought that up in the midst of that, and that he didn't think it would have been brought up. So I got it straight from the man himself that he did not consider the idea of interjecting difficult facts as some type of disrespect to him or of the evening, but that, and I talked to other veterans who understand that is what a patriot does. It's uncomfortable sometimes to insert difficult truths when other people do not want to hear them, or other people have a highly scripted evening that's part of this well-funded propaganda rollout campaign. Ken Burns,
people like Dennis Ross, yeah.
Ken Burns has gone on every TV show. He's been on with Stephen Colbert. He's been on Sam Harris's podcast. He's been on Mark Maron's podcast. This thing is getting major, major, major backing. And I still haven't heard him address why they decided to not only leave out, but if you go look at the Jim DiEugenio articles, that they actually were very dishonest in the way that they portrayed some of these details about what was actually happening during the Kennedy administration in relationship to Vietnam. So there's obviously some type of push that relates, I believe, to the post 9/11 ongoing wars of terror, including this recent amplification of Afghanistan, that are very much resonant. And there's a sense that they're using emotion that we need to now come back together, and we need to have our emotional our psychological healing and our emoting and difficult facts that we left out. I'm sure we're left out because they won't help us heal. So there's a sense that there's a streamlining or a trying to push us into wrapping up the loose, nasty emotional ends of the sort of recognized last bad war, to trying to now move into re-energizing a sense of accepting the good faith of why Afghanistan and Iraq were and are ongoing, and potentially millions of people killed in the wake of that. And no, I'm not going to have any part in staying silent in the midst of that. There's still, like I pointed out, 100,000 dead American soldiers and likely millions of dead human beings from around the world because of the ongoing lies that are very, very similar to the kind of lies that were pushed and are being pushed through this so-called public television broadcasting. I think it's shameful.
Oh, it's an absolute disgrace, and thank you for sharing all of that information. From a personal perspective, unfortunately, I haven't been in Kansas City. I haven't had a chance to make it to any of those kind of programs, but I'm glad you're getting out there. I think you're. Are you doing an event with Howard? Are you going to an event with Howard Dean tonight?
Yes, there's an event with Howard Dean tonight, and talking about transpartisanship, or whether the Republicans and Democrats are even relevant anymore. And yeah, I do. I miss your partnership out here in terms of these events. And but I'm gonna hold the fort down, and I'm appreciative that we're at least having our conversations about these things, because it is very interesting to talk to these people in person. I got to talk to Tim O'Brien in person very briefly, and gave him my flyer that I passed out to people coming in. And I just want to read this because this maybe will wrap it up in relationship also to talking to John Musgrave. And these are men and veterans who I believe are patriots of conscience, who were utilized in a very specific way in terms of this Vietnam War propaganda film. Musgrave really gives the thing a sort of down-home earthiness and a really deep perspective and an emotional content about how difficult it was to come home, and his thoughts of suicide that he overcame in relationship to the companionship of his dogs, and his commitment as a Marine to throwing off his medal when he realized it was a bad war. And also Tim O'Brien. He's obviously there's a deep, rich emotional commitment of conscience that he has, and yet they've given themselves over to this film, and it's almost a vampiric type of thing, and that's what I tried to express to them and other folks who were there that evening. Is I feel that our veterans of conscience are being taken advantage of, that their actual emotional lifeblood is being siphoned and sucked in order to create some type of sense that there's an emotional healing or an emotional psychological integrity to this thing. So I'll just read what I said. I said, why did American writer and soldier of conscience Tim O'Brien participate in and endorse in a deceptive CIA agitation-propaganda film, The Vietnam War, backed by warmongers, gangbanksters, robber barons, and other illegitimate anti-constitutional powers, Bank of America, Koch, Rockefeller, Mellon, Blavatnik, etc., complicit with and covering for those that decided to have JFK, King, RFK, and millions of others humans killed? Is Mr. O'Brien, and are you, with those who continue to treasonously deceive and criminally organize the ongoing deaths of multitudes, or with truth, justice, peace, freedom, dignity, and we the people? And I also told people to go look at relevant books: JFK and the Unspeakable by James Douglas, Mary's Mosaic by Peter Janney, JFK in Vietnam by John Newman, The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot, Final Judgment by Michael Collins Piper, and the trilogy Act of State, Orders to Kill, and The Plot to Kill King, on the U.S. deep state sponsorship of King's assassination by the King family attorney William Pepper, Esquire. So I think that I want to see more response to this propaganda film, because I believe that it's not only relevant in terms of the history from more than 50 years ago to be uncovered in ways that are relevant to now, but the way that it's resonant with the ongoing assault against Americans and humanity, and especially the Semitic Muslim world, in relationship to the majorly treasonous lie of September 11th and the ongoing wars of terror. These are massive crimes that are still occurring. This is no time to have some type of emotional closure. No, this is the time where patriots speak their mind with a wrathfulness. Compassion, yes, but a wrathfulness of intent to stop the criminality at high levels that is still continuing to kill, lots of people.
Yeah, and we talked a couple weeks ago, I think it was our last show, we talked about the whole Colin Kaepernick controversy, and this is something that I think people who may be in areas of trying to handle him are trying to keep him away from getting into what exactly, we talked about this before, what exactly the U.S. is doing around the world to Semitic Muslim people, just like people like Martin Luther King were attempted to be steered away from the criminality that the U.S. empire was committing in Southeast Asia during Vietnam. And that's another area where we're seeing just so much symmetry between now and then. And I'm so glad that you're taking the initiative and the lead on this, Jeremy, because this documentary is something I think we're going to be topic in the very near future, because I just have a feeling that with Trump, and I have a belief Trump is destined in some way, shape, or form to end up being a wartime president. And I feel we're going to be revisiting this topic in the very near future because there are a lot of similarities between now and what's going on now in the 1960s in many ways, I believe. And this documentary film, I don't think would be getting all this coverage and all this significant rollout and significant attention at this particular time in history for just no reason at all. I think there's got to be a reason behind it, and I don't think we've quite figured out what the reason is yet, but there is a reason for this, and I think perhaps it will become more clear in the weeks and months, the next couple of years to come.
Yes, and I think that it is important that we continue with our work on the internet and to be able. It's an incredible tool to be able to spread analysis and information around. But I also want to urge people to actually go to events and talk to people in person. And there's something to it that's very, very deep, and a lot of the authentic emotional and psychological work that does need to be done in relationship to some of these deep, dark truths, because they're difficult to consider, can be done in person. For example, I was able to then make contact with John Musgrave and told him I wrote 2 questions, and I actually gave you my email address on one of them so we could have a conversation about it, and so you could at least see what the question was. And he's like, I didn't get them. And the people organizing the event said that they were going to share the questions with the man who was featured in the evening, John Musgrave, and apparently they did not. So you begin to expose the way that people are being handled to some extent to themselves, and so that after that maybe there's some questioning about, okay, maybe I need to look at the way that I'm being potentially managed. And I agree with you in relationship to the resonance with the Kaepernick situation, because a lot of this does have resonance with what does it mean to be honorable to your loyalty, to your patriotism, to your oath. And I had this conversation and argument with people outside of the Liberty Hall event, the John Musgrave event, about what it takes to actually be an oath-sworn patriot in the United States of America. And having a constitutional republic where your oath is not just to follow orders. Yes, you're supposed to follow orders if they are lawful. In fact, you're supposed to not follow them if they are not lawful. And actually, you should try to expose them and call them to account up the chain of command, if that's possible. If not, then you have to whistleblow outside of the chain of command to stop illegal and unlawful orders. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That means that you have to actually think for yourself as a real oath-sworn patriot. That doesn't mean that you just run to the hills of Afghanistan after somebody says there's a boogeyman out there. It's obvious our rights are not threatened from the hills of Afghanistan or from the lagoons of Vietnam. It was known from the days of the framers that if the Bill of Rights and the Constitution were going to be under threat, it would be much closer to home. And we see this. That's what in the wake of September 11th, the most treasonous architecture of bills such as the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, the NDAA of 2012, all of this type of thing. This is being done to eviscerate the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. An oath-sworn patriot doesn't go kill nameless people, Semitic people in Muslim lands. They tell the truth out in the public, out in the open, to the face of those that are trying to get them to do illegal things. And actually, the Second Amendment is, I don't believe, going to protect our freedom at this point in time. It's important that it's there, but it's under the First Amendment where the power to return the powers back to the people and to return our God-given rights is actually located. If you are an oath-sworn patriot, a member of the military, of the services, your oath requires you to speak the truth about treason out in the open. That is very, very clear. That is your sole duty, not to go to fight illegal wars of aggression based on lies. Okay? So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Greg, for your wisdom and analysis and all of this. Until next week, Antidote, we are out.
Goodbye.
Bye.